Welcome to the latest case from Firms Consulting. Today's case will be a profitability case, and it's quite a complex profitability case. So the suggestion is that if you are going to be spending time going through this video, you should dedicate about maybe 50 minutes to an hour, maybe even a bit longer, to understand the details that sit behind this case. It's a profitability case, but a difficult one at that. And what I would suggest you do is that before you begin the case, maybe get a few clean sheets of paper. There'll be a lot of calculations, a lot of conceptual issues you would need to understand as we talk you through how to solve the case. And finally, when we present the case question, it may be a good idea to print the case question and keep it next to you, because throughout the case, we'll be referring to details that have been presented initially by the interviewer. So it's a very interesting case. And the reason we picked this case is because we wanted to teach you several concepts with regards to the pharmaceutical industry. But we also wanted to show you that profitability cases are not as easy as they look. To many candidates, profitability cases are usually the ones they practice right at the beginning, and they just naturally assume that they are so simple they could ignore them and move on to more complex cases like competition strategy, turnarounds, and so on. And what this case does is it shows you that things are not as obvious as they seem. So we're going to run through the case as if it was in a real case interview and talk you through firstly how you should approach it and the rationale behind some of the things the interviewer is asking for and how you need to respond to those things. So in any particular case, the first thing you would get is you would receive the case itself. Now the case could either be read out to you, so you're sitting across from an interviewer and the case could be read out to you, or the case could be given to you as a printed sheet of paper. Either option could work, right? This particular case is a McKinsey case. It's at the difficult level. It's not something that we expect people to be able to grasp if they're beginning their training. In fact, this is the kind of cases that we would give to our candidates towards the end of their training, usually when they've finished all of their training and we're going through drills to test them across more and more difficult cases. You should expect to take about 30 to 40 minutes up to an hour to do this case. And in reality, very few candidates would be expected to complete the case in its entirety. And more likely the interviewer would point out different parts of the case that they want you to focus on and they want you to explore in more detail. Now this is the case. I'm going to read through it. And what I've done here is I've split it up into two parts, right? The first part is the part in black and the other part is in gray. Depending on the interviewer, they may give you all of the information up front, or they may withhold some of that information. For example, if I was running a case, I would only give you the part in black. The CEO of a client recently commissioned an internal benchmarking initiative. The initiative's results, which are not being questioned, indicate the client's costs are far above competitors. The CEO wants you to reduce R&D costs. He wants you to start here while growing revenue. And all of the rest of the information, which is very important, is information that the interviewer may give you throughout the case in drips and drabs, or they may give it to you up front. Now, if they give it to you up front, it's going to be information overload. And obviously, if they give it to you later, it depends on you asking for that information or taking a hint when they offer it to extract the information. So let's go through the detail, right? All of the R&D facilities and staff are concentrated in the Boston area. There are approximately 2,300 R&D employees, and the total R&D costs are approximately $12 billion per annum. The client has traditionally received 80% of its total revenue, which is $24 billion, from drugs to treat heart disease, blood pressure, and liver disease. 80% of these patents from these three drugs will expire by 2015, and the company therefore expanded research into adjacent areas in 2010. Not getting satisfactory results, the company again expanded the research portfolio in 2012. The clinical trials team is pushing for an expansion of R&D, citing their ability to conduct 20% more trials than their current volume. Of every 10 drugs in the final stage, there are 6 drugs in the final stage. Of the 5-stage trials process, only 3 will go on to receive FDA approval. 2 of the 3 will recoup their initial investments to bring them to market, and just 1 of the 2 will generate more than $1 billion in revenue per year. Now, the first thing you need to do when you receive information like this is you need to take a few minutes to understand what you have been given. It is impossible to solve a case unless you understand what has been given to you. So what I would do is, and what I recommend people do is, once the information is given to you, you ask for the interviewer to give you a few minutes, and you highlight all those things in the case that are not very clear or require clarification, another way of saying it. So for example, the initiative results which are not being questioned, does that mean that you in the case are not meant to question the study? Or does it mean that the study is not being questioned, but it should be questioned? Patents, 80% are expiring. What do they mean by expanded the research portfolio? What do they mean by the 5-stage trials process? What do you mean only 3 will receive FDA approval? Those are some of the things to me, if I was doing this case, are a bit ambiguous and require clarification. So I take a few minutes, no more than 3 to 4 minutes, go through the case, and I would come up with a list of questions that would help me understand the case. And clearly anything that is in the case question itself that is not clear should be part of those clarifying questions, right? So what happens next, right? You have these clarifying questions. Clearly, you will have to start by actually asking the interviewer the questions you've collected when you took those few minutes to yourself, right? But remember this. If you're given a lot of information up front, the odds are pretty high that the interviewer is not interested in hearing more clarifying questions. You've been given so much data up front. The interviewer pretty much believes that because of the volume of information you've been given, you should be able to come up with a structure at the beginning. If you've been given less information up front, like maybe just a 2-line case, then the odds are pretty high the interviewer would tolerate additional questions. However, that being said, you should always ask the interviewer what they would prefer. So I would do something like this. I would, after I'd finished with my 3-minute pause, I'd say, okay, I'm ready to begin. Now, thank you for the information. Would you prefer to see my approach prior to my clarifying question? So what you're telling the interviewer is that you do have some things that are not clear, but you know that he may want to see the approach first, so you're giving him an option. So the interviewer may respond and say, yes, tell me your clarifying questions. Or if this is a McKinsey case, most likely they would say, yes, please give me your approach. And they may offer you some, tips. Now, here, when they talk about the 5 stages of probability figures, it's a hint, right? Take the figures and understand what they're used for. There are very few cases where interviewers try to mislead you. In fact, interviewers are not trained to mislead you. They don't start a case by saying, okay, how can I deliberately lead you down a wrong path, right? Interviewers don't mislead. In fact, due to time constraints in a case, they try to provide guidance every single time they speak. So every time an interviewer is speaking to you, they're trying to guide you. Sometimes they're trying to test whether what you're saying makes sense, but they're never misleading you. Every time they speak, they're giving you more information. In fact, the more times you get an interviewer to speak, the more times you are collecting useful information in the case, right? So whenever an interviewer speaks, listen to the verbal clues very carefully. Take them down. In fact, on one of your sheets of paper, you should have 2 sheets of paper in a case, one to write out your structure and another one for calculations. In one of your sheets where you do calculations, I'd create a little column and all the information the interviewer has given me, I'd write it down there. I may not know how to use it immediately, but I'd keep it because clearly it's useful information. Now we're going to do a little bit of a timeout here. And the reason for a timeout is because although we've structured this case well, or at least we've attempted to structure the case by understanding it, I think about 99% of candidates don't know what to do with this information once they get it. Once you've asked these clarifying questions, how do you actually build a structure or a framework for your case? Do you build a decision tree? Do you throw out hypotheses? Do you do a combination of both? How do you move forward? So what we're going to do is going to take a short timeout and show you how we would typically structure a case, and then we'll move back into the case. There are typically 3 approaches to solve full case questions, and I distinguish full case questions from estimation questions, brain teasers, and market sizing cases. For those group of cases, there is a different approach to solve them, which are covered in our other videos, right? So what are the 3 approaches to solve full case questions? Well, let's think about it for a second. We have the famous hypothesis-based approach, or the hypotheses-based approach, which, to be fair, many people refer to it and talk about it a lot, but I think most people don't know at all how to use it and what it means. Finally, we have the decision tree approach, which many people consider to be different from the hypothesis-based approach. And then we have the no structure approach, where you basically guess your way through a case. And let's give you some examples of all 3 approaches. In the hypothesis approach, you would, based on the information you received in the case, you would tell the interviewer, well, I think that the increased clinical trials is leading to higher R&D costs, and this will be something I want to examine. That's an example of an hypothesis. The decision tree is basically the left-hand side of this chart. right? We're going to talk about this a lot more throughout the rest of the video, so we're going to park this issue for now. But basically, a decision tree allows you to break down an issue into, break down a question into either the drivers of the issue or the options to solve the issue. We're not going to delve into this now because we're going to cover it extensively later. And no structure is where you just guess. You say, well, I read this in the news that maybe salaries are too high and they're inefficient. You're guessing. No one solves a case by guessing, and you're all undeniably going to be rejected at some point in that interview, and you're pretty much going to piss off your interviewer. Now let's look at hypotheses. What I want to do here is show you why hypotheses are difficult to work with, and then show you how you can bring structure to your hypotheses. So let's come up with 3 hypotheses based on the information you've already seen in the case. You may want to pause the video here and try to develop 3 hypotheses yourself and compare them to what we come up with, or you can simply watch the video and practice later. So you've seen the first hypothesis. Let's look at the second hypothesis, right? And what we're going to do is, as we structure out all the hypotheses, we're going to show you why they are difficult to work with, and what exactly what do we mean when we say they're difficult, what makes them difficult, and why that's a problem in solving cases. Well, the second hypothesis is that we could say launching research in so many areas so quickly must lead to so many inefficiencies, which are areas that we need to explore, right? That could be a plausible hypothesis. And the third hypothesis, which we would end off with just 3 here, is I wonder if there are any synergies between the trials, like procurement of material, and we may be able to cut costs there as well. Now, I want to ask you this. Would you be proud of these hypotheses and consider them a good start to the case? And ask yourself this, do they make sense to you? I think about 90% of people would agree that these are great hypotheses, because the first one looks at clinical trials, the second one looks at inefficiencies, and the third one looks at synergies, broad enough areas to cover everything. But the reality is that these hypotheses are not mutually exclusive, right? Inefficiencies is the flip side of synergies. Think about that very carefully. The opposite of inefficiency is synergy. So when you're measuring inefficiency in hypothesis 2, you're actually measuring the opportunity for synergies, which is covered in hypothesis 3. And hypothesis 3, when you're looking for the benefits from synergies, you're obviously looking at the opportunities to cut out inefficiencies. So hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3 are not mutually exclusive. Moreover, it's clear some of the inefficiencies or synergies are going to be related to clinical trials. So we can see that hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3 are not mutually exclusive. But we can also see that hypothesis 1 is partly measured in hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3. So we are double counting and in some cases triple counting here, right? And that's the problem with hypotheses. Because they tend to be this fairly large mass of text, as you can see, it's very difficult to know when they are mutually exclusive. And this raises 3 problems with hypotheses. The one is that they require prior knowledge, right? It's very difficult to develop an hypothesis or a set of hypotheses for a case unless you tend to have prior knowledge about how to do them or about the sector and the company. Despite what people may say, that's one of the rules about hypotheses. You need to have prior knowledge. Second is that they are very Macy light. What I mean by that is it's difficult to develop hypotheses that are mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. Because there are so many parts to an hypothesis, it's very difficult to lay them up side by side and say what is in one, what is in the second hypothesis, what is in the third hypothesis, and are they different? And finally, the purpose. You've come up with these beautiful hypotheses, but to solve what problem? Because at this point, we haven't really figured out what the problem is in the case. We've been given a lot of data and told to cut costs, but the problem is not clear. And if you have a lot of hypotheses, but the purpose of the hypotheses are not clear, how do you know you are solving anything meaningful? And this obviously raises 2 obvious questions. Which approach should you use to tackle cases? And then how do you build a framework? So do you use the hypothesis-based approach, decision trees? Do you guess your way through it? That's the first question. The second one is, once you've chosen an approach, how do you build your structure? Well, what we're going to show you is that decision trees can drive hypotheses. And in fact, the best decision trees do drive hypotheses. And in reality, when you're in an actual project with McKinsey and BCG and Bain, and you are in a sector where you know nothing about it, you are forced to build hypotheses first and then tack your hypotheses onto those decision trees. So let's now continue with our timeout and actually build what we have here, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to show you how you build the structure to your case. And the most important thing we want you to understand here is that when you get a case, you must understand the key question you are trying to solve in the case. And to many of you, the concept of a key question will be alien because it's not something that's taught formally in any case books around the world, but it's an important question, and I'm going to prove to you that it's an important question, right? Let's look at the case we've been given earlier. I asked you to print it out and have a look at it. So print it out, have a look at the printout. One interpretation of the case would be how to reduce costs and increase revenue simultaneously. That is the purpose of the case. And if that was the purpose of the case, the sub-questions to solve that case would be how to increase revenue and how to reduce R&D costs. But what if, as a result of having a discussion with the interviewer, he tells you to only focus on R&D costs and ignore revenue for now? Then the key question would change, wouldn't it? The key question would be how to reduce R&D costs, because the interviewer has told you to just focus on R&D costs. And clearly the sub-questions to reduce R&D costs would be the buckets of R&D costs, which is labor, equipment costs, land and buildings, inventory, and clinical trials. But what if the interviewer changed it even further? What if he said, okay, I want you to focus on costs in this case, but only costs that can be cut in the short term? Well, clearly, inventory and clinical trials are the only things that can be cut in the short term. Labor costs, given the legal requirements, it's going to take a few months to fire people, or euphemistically, right-size the business. It'll take a few months to inventory equipment, sell them, and close the sale. It'll take a long time to sell land and buildings. It's not something that happens overnight. Now, what do you notice here? Well, you should notice that depending on the way you read the case, and depending on what information the interviewer gives you, you can come up with one of three and possibly even more key questions to solve in this case. But you have to agree the key question you're solving in the case, right? With the interviewer. Because if you solve the wrong key question, or if you identify the wrong key question, you will solve the wrong part of the case. And as you can see, that different key questions generate different sub-questions. And what you should know about your sub-questions is that they are your framework, right? So if you want to know how to build a framework for a case, well, the way to do it is identify a key question, identify the sub-questions, and the sub-questions become your framework. And if we look at the middle scenario, how to reduce costs, right? The first part of your framework would be these 5 areas for analysis. And we could break down labor costs into maybe fixed labor costs and indirect labor costs, or specialized, technical, and administrative labor costs. The point is, if you identify your key question, if you break down your sub-questions, you automatically start generating your framework. And in fact, what this approach does is it teaches you to build frameworks without the need to memorize frameworks. And we get this a lot where people would come to us and say, I built this approach, but people tell me it doesn't exactly solve the case, because you're building approaches independent of the key question in the case. You're just using an approach because it sounds vaguely familiar, but your approach is not directly tied to the case. So just step back for a minute here. We've been given all this information from the case, that whole sheet at the beginning. From that case, we asked a few clarifying questions. Well, we were allowed to ask one. From there, we identified a key question and we agreed with the interviewer. And then we generate sub-questions, which becomes our framework. Now, what happens from here, right? Now, we're going to show you how to build hypotheses from a decision tree going forward. It's not difficult to do, it's actually easy to do. And the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to use we're going to use one of the scenarios that we listed earlier, and we're going to expand it even further. So let's take the middle scenario where we had to reduce costs, and we know there were 5 areas to analyze. So we're going to build an hypothesis for just one of these 5 buckets of analysis, right? And the area we're going to analyze is how to reduce clinical trials. Now, the initial hypothesis we developed much earlier, which if you go back in the video, you'd see, is we said, I think the increased clinical trials is leading to the higher R&D costs, and this will be something I want to examine. For those of you who understand how to build hypotheses, you'd know that is not an hypothesis. An hypothesis, let's first explain what an hypothesis is. If you look at the definition of hypothesis in the dictionary, it comes from a Greek word, I believe, and it has something to do with having an observable phenomenon. So let's assume you have an observable phenomenon, which in this case could be anything from increased R&D cost to decrease profitability. You have an observable phenomenon. Something is causing that observable phenomenon to occur. And that observable phenomenon has an effect on some other part of the business. Your hypothesis should consist of three parts. It should say, due to X, there has been an increase in Y, which is the observable phenomenon, which has led to Z. Now, the reason we break an hypothesis into three parts is so that we can test it. When an hypothesis only has one part, for example, some people would say, my hypothesis is that labor costs are going up. It's like a no-brainer. It is almost impossible to test, and even if you can test it, you cannot test cause and effect. And that's the key thing to an hypothesis. You must be able to test cause and effect. And of course, with this kind of structuring of your hypothesis, you can collect data to have it verified. Now, what I'm going to do is, using this structure, I'm going to take this hypothesis that's written on the top and rewrite it in a correct structure. The correct structure should be, due to patents expiring, there has been an increase in trials to find new drugs, which has led to an increase in R&D tests. And this is verifiable. You can look at the company data to see when patents expire. Tick. There has been an increase in trials to find new drugs. You can see if there's been an increase in trials to find new drugs and when there's a correlation with patents expiring. And obviously then you could clearly see whether R&D costs have gone up. And the most important thing you have to understand here is that a key question structures the decision tree, as we've shown earlier. And if you want to, you can use that decision tree to structure your Macy hypotheses. The other thing you need to understand is that you don't need hypotheses to solve a case. As you can see here on the left-hand side, the decision tree gives you a lot of structure anyway. And you can pretty much solve the case by focusing on that structure without the need to generate hypotheses. So don't feel a need to generate hypotheses. You don't really need it. If you feel comfortable doing it, that's great. But if you feel comfortable using decision trees, that will also be the right way to proceed. So what we're going to do now is that we're going to end off by tying up the timeout, because we started off by showing you the different kinds of ways to solve cases, hypotheses, decision trees. We then zoomed in a little bit further and showed you the importance of the key question to building your sub-questions, which become your framework. We then showed you how that framework can be used to generate hypotheses. And now I want to delve a little bit into how you actually build these sub-questions which lead to a framework, right? So now we're going to use the same example. This is one way to break out the sub-questions or sub-issues of the key question. Another perfectly plausible way is this. If someone told me, or if we were doing a case and we agreed that the key question was how to reduce R&D costs, if someone broke down R&D costs into the 5 major cost buckets, that's good. If someone broke down the issue into these 5 areas, customers, competitors, cost, company, and market structure, is also fine. But which is correct? Well, there's a difference between both. The first one, you are breaking down your sub-questions into the Macy options. In other words, what are the independent options that can help you solve this question? In other words, if we reduce labor costs, could we reduce R&D costs? Yes. They are mutually exclusive because you can reduce labor costs independent of equipment costs, just as you could reduce equipment costs independent of land and buildings, inventory, and clinical trials. So in the first approach, we've broken down the sub-issues into the options, and the second one into the areas of analysis. Approaches 1 and 2 are both correct. But approach 2 is inefficient, and why is that? Well, let's think about it for a minute, right? Think about the typical format of a case. You've been given a case in writing or verbally. You've got to understand the issues. You've got to ask clarifying questions and build out the context. You then got to analyze the problem through your questioning. And as you analyze the problem, you start understanding the problem. And once you've pinpointed the problem, you develop options to fix the problem. You usually develop up to 3 or 4 options. You then come up with a set of criteria to analyze the options, pick 1 or 2 preferred options, and then give your summary and your recommended option, right? So it should be obvious to you by now that the singular purpose of analysis is to identify the options. We do analysis to identify the options to fix the problem. We don't do analysis because, well, every consultant does it. We do analysis to identify the options, and then we analyze the options as well. But if the options are apparent, you should jump to them immediately because it cuts out some of the unnecessary analysis time up front. And when presenting the options first, for those of you who are familiar with this technique, Bain likes it, McKinsey likes it, you go for the answer first approach. That's what the answer first approach is, where you present the options to solve the problem up front. But of course, that implies that you should know what the problem is. If you're not clear what the problem is and you don't understand the case perfectly, then it is okay to structure the issues around the key question, around areas of analysis that would help you identify the options. So, with that in mind, we're now going to jump back to the case using that theory and show you how we've applied it, right? So it's quite a simple process here where we're simply going to use the information that we've been given to sketch out a key question and sub-question. And if you can, think about the issue of revenue growth and cost reduction. I mean, the interviewer tells you that cost reduction is the priority, but he also wants you to look at revenue growth, so you need to think about that. Well, the key question here is how to reduce R&D costs from 12 billion while growing revenue from 24 billion. Whenever you sketch out your key question, it is vital you put in numbers. Numbers give you direction. Numbers tell you the scope of magnitude of what you're trying to achieve. A key question void of numbers is not a very good key question. In fact, a key question void of numbers is probably not going to help you at all. Again, you then break out your areas of analysis. Now, the thing with this, you could either break it out into fixed and variable buckets, which would be fine, but I picked the major buckets of analysis. What you must always remember is that when you interview with McKinsey, they always like it when you say, these are the broad areas I'm going to analyze. You give a brief description, and tell them why you want to analyze it. So for labor, you could say that, well, we've been adding so much investment into R&D, hiring so many people, but the number of drugs we've been putting out has decreased. So there seems to be some inefficiency here. And then obviously, if you're expanding new areas of research, you're probably acquiring new equipment, especially if you're branching into new areas, as mentioned, like hepatitis and so on. There probably are opportunities to consolidate this or buy less. All the staff are based in Boston. There would seem to be opportunities to consolidate them because commuting shouldn't be much of a problem. Chemical inventory must be a problem. The more clinical trials you run and the more compounds you are researching, well, clearly there must be opportunities here to either change procurement or at least get some efficiencies in. And then the aggressive push to find new revenues must be driving trials, so we need to find a way to improve the hit rate on our trials. Now, let's just step back a second. So you've given the interviewer a key question. You very quickly, at the same time, went into your buckets of analysis. But which one do you analyze? Well, when you are not sure which bucket to analyze, there are two ways to find out. The first one is split the cost. These are all costs. So find out what contribution does labor make up of total R&D costs. Find out the percentage. Always convert percentages to absolute numbers. It becomes a nightmare to work with percentages if you don't convert them to absolute numbers. Whenever you are working with a decision tree, even if you continue building out this decision tree, always carry your numbers across to prevent arithmetic errors. But also by carrying your numbers across, you can see the relative sizes of the branches and you can determine which one is more important than the other one. Now, many people would say because trials and labor are the biggest buckets, they are worth analyzing. But the size is not the only thing you need to consider. You also need to consider the trend. If trials cost was 38% but was steeply going down, then you may not want to analyze it. But here we see labor and trials costs are large but going up. So clearly, that has to be the two areas we want to analyze, right? I mean, the cost buckets are large and they're going up. There's, unless there's something seriously, crazily unnatural about equipment and machines, there's going to be this huge order coming down the line, which is information the interviewer would have to give us. It'll make sense to analyze labor, but obviously starting with trials. Now, the other thing you also have to understand is that this is the application of the 80-20 principle. By looking at the size of the buckets and by looking at their trends, we have determined that these 2 out of 5 major areas will most likely give us 80% of the answer. And now we've got to continuously build that. And what most people would do is they'd say, let's start with trials and let's just do what we did with R&D costs for trials. We'd break down trials into its overall area, right? That break it into preclinical, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and awaiting approval. These stages shouldn't be new to you. They were mentioned initially in the case. You may have had to ask for clarification, but all this information is there. And they would have done what was done earlier. They'd split down trials into its component buckets. So preclinical makes up 20%. They would carry the numbers across, and they would work out the trend. And most people would be pretty happy with themselves, right? They would say, wow, this is fantastic, we're doing everything right. But the problem with this is you're following the numbers too closely without thinking very carefully about the information you've been given up front, right? So think about what was given to you up front, right? You were given a lot of information about patents expiring and all kinds of things. Now we know that they want to increase revenue and they want to reduce R&D costs. But clearly the amount of R&D done directly drives revenue. It may be a lag effect, but it definitely drives revenue. R&D done today leads to revenue 3 or 4 years down the line, right? We know that R&D costs are being driven by the number of clinical trials. That's a fact. We know that the more clinical trials run increases the probability of finding a promising drug. That's obvious. A promising drug drives revenue growth. You find a promising drug, you drive revenue growth. So since revenue growth requirements drive trials, which drives R&D costs, we need to calculate the revenue growth requirements because that is driving clinical trials, which is driving R&D costs. In other words, R&D costs are not independent of revenue growth. They are linked. If you cut revenue growth, if you cut R&D costs or you cut trials, you will end up cutting revenue. But before you cut revenue, you need to determine what your revenue targets are, because if they are linked, your revenue targets would drive your clinical trials requirements, which drives your clinical trials costs, which drives your R&D costs. And that is the big insight here. Now, all this data has been given to you. It's just about putting the links together. Let's work with it. So let's just do the math. Let's calculate the revenue gap. We know the revenue is $24 billion. We know that 80% of the $24 billion comes from 3 drugs or 3 classes of drugs. And we know 80% of the patents for those 3 classes of drugs would be expiring in 2015. So 80% of 24 billion gives us the 3 classes of drugs. 80% of that number gives us the amount of patents that are expiring, which is $15.4 billion, right? Now, if we assume that they will lose 50% of their revenue in the year they lose their patents, which is 2015, then we can work out that their revenue gap they need to fill is $7.7 billion. In fact, even if you ignore revenue growth, just to keep their revenue where it is today, they need to find $7.7 billion in new revenue. In other words, they need to find about $7 to $8 billion drugs. Now, you can make different assumptions in terms of the market that will be lost when the patent expires. You could say 90% will be lost. You could say 50%. I went with 50%. It seemed like the right thing to do, right? But more important data has been given to you also at the beginning, and you need to use it. So let's just work with that. At the beginning, you were told that 3 out of 10 drugs passed the final stage. So 30% going to the next stage. We were told 2 out of 3 from that stage passed FDA approval, which is 66%. Of the 2 out of 3, 1 will become a billion-dollar drug, which is 50%. You were also told 6 drugs are in the final stage. So just simply plugging in the numbers will tell you that you have a very, very bad pipeline coming up. In fact, the probability says you're only going to produce half of a billion-dollar drug, which is a $500 million drug, right? Now remember, the interviewer offered to give you the probability numbers for each stages. Well, let's assume he gave it to you, and then you just have to carry the 6 upwards, do the math, roll it upwards to figure out how many compounds were being put into the pipeline at the beginning of the funnel to generate that $500 million worth of sales from the new drug, or half of a billion-dollar drug, right? So basically 4,460 compounds had to be put into stage 1 to get 0.6 of a billion-dollar drug. Now, this changes the case dramatically because we now know the minimum target we are chasing of new revenue is $7 billion. And if clinical trials costs and R&D costs are linked, then we have to figure out what the link is. We now know what it is. And we have to now figure out what we need to do on clinical trials to get $7 billion worth of new revenue. I'm going to put it to you in a different way. Because what we've now done is we've identified the problem. The problem here is that R&D costs are not independent of revenue. If you want a certain revenue target, you have to put in a certain amount of compounds at the beginning of the R&D process in the preclinical stage, right? The more compounds you put in, obviously the more drugs come out at the bottom. So what are the options available to the company? Well, let's think about this for the second, right? We have a number of options available. Option 1, if you increase the number of preclinical compounds going through at the beginning, you obviously have more chance of drugs coming out at the bottom, right? That's basic logic. If 4,460 compounds gives you 0.6 of $1 billion drug, obviously more than 4,460 compounds will give you more $1 billion drugs. So that's one thing you could do. The other thing you could do is not change the number of compounds going in, but you could change their weighting. So put in 4,460 compounds, but rather than investing in areas like hepatitis and HIV where the company does not have a lot of expertise and where the probability of finding a $1 billion drug is small and where the market size may not be large enough, you could weight that portfolio towards areas the company knows better and where the market size is large enough. And finally, ignore the portfolio, but you could look at things to do to increase the probability of success. For example, the FDA may only want to improve this drug if the company committed to doing certain kind of advertising around the usage and the risks of using the drug, and the company could agree to do that, which would increase its probability of the drug being approved at FDA stage. Now, I'm going to do a little timeout here again because I think it's very important that you understand the way we came up with options. These options are not the same. They are profoundly different. And just to recap the case, you were given a lot of data. You focused on costs because that's what the interviewer told you to do. But you figured out that costs were being driven, or there's a link between costs and revenue. And you realized that the revenue requirements were driving R&D costs and clinical trials costs. You then worked out what the revenue requirements were. And you realized that given the revenue requirements, you have to increase the number of clinical trials going through the process. And you came up with 3 ways to increase the number of billion-dollar drugs, right? So either increase the number of compounds or you find some way to produce more billion-dollar drugs. And these were the 3 options you came up with to fix the problem. And if you step back to the first time out we had, remember we said you do the analysis to arrive at the options, right? So here we did the same thing. We did some, even though we listed some options up front, we still did more analysis to arrive at a much more succinct and much more specific options. So let's understand the differences between these options, right? Now we know the current portfolio equals 4,460 compounds in the preclinical stage. And for the sake of argument, let's assume it's split into 4 broad areas of research. Let's assume 56% of the compounds are for heart disease, 22% are for liver, 12% for lung, or whatever it is, right? Now, option 1, what is option 1 saying? Option 1 is saying that the ratio split between the areas of research would stay the same, but we'd be sending more drugs down the funnel. So, for example, let's assume we were going to double the amount of compounds going into preclinical research. The ratio split between the 4 areas would stay the same. So we're basically going to increase the size of compounds going through. We're going to research more compounds, which would raise associated labor, equipment, and material costs, right? What about option 2? Well, option 2 is saying we're going to we're going to change the portfolio. Maybe we're going to drop one of the areas we're going to research. So we're going to change the portfolio, right? Dropping a compound reduces associated labor, equipment, and material costs. So you can see the difference between option 1 and option 2. In option 1, you increase the size of the portfolio, but you don't change its weighting. In option 2, you don't change the size, but you change the portfolio weighting. And then let's look at option 3. In option 3, you will go outside the portfolio. So the number of drugs stay the same. The split or the weighting of the portfolio stays the same, but you try to influence things that are not part of the portfolio, like FDA approvals, packaging, distribution, and so on, right? So just to recap, option 1 will increase revenue but likely increase costs as well. And we don't want that. We're trying to cut costs while we're trying to decrease revenue. Option 2 is going to reduce the size of the portfolio, which will lower costs, but it could also increase revenue by switching to areas of analysis or compounds or themes of diseases where we have better expertise. And option 3, well, option 3 is not changing the portfolio, so costs are unlikely to change there, but it could lead to major changes in the way the drugs are marketed or the distribution, which will lead to its own cost. So revenue and cost go up in option 1 and 2, so in option 1 and 3. But for option 2, costs are likely to go down while revenue goes up. And obviously that becomes the option we want to analyze in greater detail, which then takes us to the next part of the case. Because now that you want to analyze the portfolio, clearly the most important thing you have to do is you have to get a breakdown of that portfolio. And in this particular case, you need to ask the interviewer if there's any data about the portfolio of compounds researched and the success rate and cost attached to each part of the portfolio. And you have to assume, for example, that the interviewer provides the table below. And what I'll do here is maybe take a time out, pause the video to analyze the table below and see what kind of insights you develop from it before we go through the analysis. Now, the most important thing about reading any graphic is that you're not looking for these one or two pieces of insight that will just solve the day. You've heard of the concept of storyboarding, I'm sure by now, if you're doing this case. You've done a few cases, you've done some research and management consulting, so you know the concept of storyboarding. Storyboarding is where you take pieces of insight or pieces of analysis and you lay it out together to generate a story. In analyzing exhibits, it's no different. In a table like this, and it's quite a complicated looking table, you're going to find more than one important insight. Do not treat each insight as an independent issue. If you treat them independently, you're not going to see the story out of the numbers. What is more important to do is to capture all of the insights, so write them down on a piece of paper, and then look at the story generated from them. Now, I've done that as well, and I'm going to show you how I've rearranged them to generate a story. I've come up with 4 insights here, and I'm going to show you how it was rearranged to generate a story. Well, the first insight is that 47% of R&D spend goes to areas where the client is strongest, right? Heart, blood, liver, and 53% is broadly in the infectious areas category where they have no skills and capability, right? And they're spending 53% of their money where the markets are smaller, there's a lower probability of success, and where competitors are spending more. Why would you cut down your spending where you are strong, where the markets are larger, and where your competitors have no hope in hell of beating you? It just doesn't make sense to do that. And beyond that, look at the number of drugs that was generated despite the cost spent, right? So basically, in these new areas, a lot of money is being pumped in, but the cost to produce one drug is much higher, which means the yield for a drug is much lower. Obviously, if it costs more to produce a drug, the time to recoup the profits takes a much longer. And considering the fact that patents for all drugs are the same, drugs that take longer to have a payback have a smaller period to recoup profits, which means their yields will automatically be lower. And then finally, there's no rationale for doing this because applying clients' existing knowledge to the unrelated infectious disease market makes no sense, right? And what you can see is I built a storyboard. 4 facts or 4 insights on the data laid up front gives me a storyboard. Now you have to use this information and think about how you would talk about the recommendations you're going to make. You've done a lot of analysis now, and by this point you have to come up with some steps forward, right? What would I recommend? Well, this is what I would recommend from the case. Cutting the trial spend by 53%, that's the total budget on new infectious diseases, saves $2.45 billion, right? And since these infectious diseases have a low probability of finding drugs and will take a long time to come to market, the immediate revenue impact is going to be low. Well, we'll take the $2.45 billion and reallocate the majority of that to the client's traditional research areas of heart, liver, and blood, because the table earlier shows me that the markets there are much more promising, the probability of success is larger, and the yield for those drugs is much higher. But let's do some calculations, right? We know that 4,460 compounds are run through clinical trials, and it costs $4.6 billion for clinical trials. Therefore, it costs just over $1 million to run one compound through the entire trials process, right? If we are going to be reducing our trials budget by $2.45 billion, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of the $2.45 billion, with the exception of $1 billion, and reallocate it just to heart, liver, and blood, which means my new trials budget would be $3.6 billion, and I'm spending roughly $1 million per compound, which means that I'm now going to be analyzing 3,600 compounds. I still have the $1 billion of savings, which I have not used. More than that, we also know that the probabilities of a success are going to change because we are no longer analyzing drugs with a low probability of success. So yeah, you can assume the probabilities are going to go up anywhere from 50% to 100%. Some people would say 100% because the data shows it, but I would say put it at 50% because there are other things that could go wrong as you scale the process. And now you can redo the calculations, right? These are the original calculations. You can put in the new clinical trial numbers. You got 3,600 drugs going through with new probabilities of success, each one going up by 50%, which means now, even though you've reduced the number of drugs in preclinical stages from 4,460 to 3,600, you have about $4 billion drugs coming out of the pipeline, right? So now that's the analysis. Now, how do we tie this all together? Obviously, the tie-up is the most important thing. It's what counts at the end of the day. So let's think about how we actually tie this all together. And the important thing is to know is that how you explain the data you've put together is obviously far more important than the actual data you generate. So let's think about this for a second, right? Cutting infectious trials completely and reinvesting all that savings, which is about $2.45 billion, with the exception of $1 billion in the company's stronger research areas, will just about increase billion-dollar drug output 7 times, right? It goes from $0.6 billion drugs to $3.7 billion drugs. These actions still save $1 billion. We haven't allocated $1 billion, but they increase the billion-dollar drug output basically 4 times, right? It still leaves us short 3 of the $7 billion drugs we need. You could argue they need 8 just to get a slight revenue increase, but I went with 7 here because the numbers are approximated anyway. Now, if we assume R&D labor is directly proportional to the number of compounds in the trials, which is a fair estimate to make, we could assume the ratio decrease in labor costs is equal to the ratio decrease in trials. Now, think about this for a second. If you're decreasing trials by 22%, so you're still saving $1 billion, right? That's 22% of the total trials costs. It's fair to assume that the labor is split equally across these areas of research, right? So labor that would have been used if you spent $1 billion are no longer going to be used. And you can assume it's roughly equal. So if labor is $3.6 billion, 22% of that is $790 million. So what we can see by canceling infectious trials and reducing infectious labor research costs, we can save $1.79 billion. In fact, you could probably save some on equipment as well, but we didn't put that in here because we were given no equipment information, but you could always ask for that as well. You may even be able to consolidate some buildings, it's possible, but no data was provided for that, but you can mention that to the interviewer. Now, you still have saved $1.79 billion throughout this process, but you've only produced $4 billion drugs. Now, all other things being equal, right? That $1.79 billion can be plowed back into R&D, particularly trials, right? To generate 2 new billion-dollar drugs. How do we come up with 2? Well, if $3.6 billion generates $4 billion drugs, then $1.79 billion, which is half of $3.6 billion, should generate $2 billion drugs. But it still leaves us $1 billion drug. So, no matter, even if we reallocated the R&D budget and didn't cut it at all, so we just, you notice that we just reallocated at this point. All the savings now plowed it back into research. So R&D budget hasn't changed on trials or anything like that. It's simply been refocused on heart and the traditional areas. We're still short of $1 billion drug, which means we'd need to raise our R&D budget by $900 million just to produce that $1 billion drug shortfall. The reality is we could not grow revenue and cut R&D costs at the same time. An acquisition may be the more realistic option given the time and funding limits. And you can always ask the interviewer, should I analyze this? And the interviewer will tell you, no, maybe, it's really up to you, right? But at this point, you've pretty much answered the case. And it's maybe worthwhile to spend some time looking at some of the observations and lessons from this case. I think the first thing that's important to understand is that this is a data-intensive case. But clearly, if you just follow the data, you will make mistakes. You need to really think carefully. What are the relationships between the data? You can't just follow the data. You've got to think about the relationships between them. In cases that are this complex and with so much data floating around, you cannot solve the case unless you have a very good structure built up front. And without the structure, what will happen is that you'll constantly find interesting data worth analyzing that has nothing to do with solving the case. The structure guides you. It tells you what's within scope and what's out of scope. Things may look really interesting, but if they're not within scope, you ignore it. This case is too long to complete in one session. There is no way that an interviewer is going to ask you to do this case in one session, right? It's most likely they're going to pick pieces of analysis and ask you to focus on them. And of course, because it's a McKinsey interviewer-led case, that works out quite well because the interviewer can pick areas he wants you to analyze. But the reason why this case works well is because people want to test your math, have ample opportunity to do that, and people want to test logic, have ample opportunity to do that. So it's a bit for everyone here. I think the other thing you need to understand here is that many candidates try to solve cases by rote. They just throw out a structure because they've learned that this is the structure to use, and they work with it. That will hurt you. If you did that, you'll end up analyzing cost till you're blue in the face, and maybe you'll figure out the link between revenue later. But in other words, you're going to be inefficient. It's important to identify the key question, build out the sub-issues which become your framework, and then understand the relationship, if there's any, between those issues, right? What you'll realize here is that R&D costs are not mutually exclusive of revenue, even though R&D is not a variable cost, right? And another important lesson here is that pharmaceutical cases invariably use the stage gate approach, preclinical step, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then the final stage. The stage gate approach, where you work with ratios and probabilities of success, has been adopted by just about every industry, from the oil and gas industry to business cases, venture capital, and so on. So it's important you understand that process and you know how to deal with it. In this case, we present revenue and cost, and we present it as two separate issues. It is very unlikely that in a real case, two issues will be so unlinked or unlinked at all. Mostly they will be linked, and it's your job to find that linkage. And finally, I think it's important for you to understand that decision trees and hypotheses are not mutually exclusive problem-solving techniques. We've shown you why they are the same technique. And in fact, if you read Kenichi Oma's early book, The Mind of a Strategist, the guy who basically built McKinsey's strategy practice when he was director of the Tokyo office and Greater Asia, he explains it very well how hypotheses and decision trees are linked. It's just recently, as consulting training has become a cottage industry, people have tried to separate them because they haven't seen the linkage between both. But as you can see in this case, they are very much linked. They are not different. The question is whether you want to use a decision tree to solve a case throughout, or whether you want to use a decision tree to generate hypotheses and then solve the case. Either option can work. It's really up to you where you want to take this. And I think those are some of the very important lessons. There are obviously other lessons. I mean, if someone weak in math is obviously going to take out more math lessons. Those weak in conceptualizing and structuring cases will also take out very different lessons. But I think the most important thing here is that you have to understand how to structure a case and how to build it, right? You can always play back the video to understand the approach. For me, the most important thing is that people would look at the timeouts, because the timeouts present the background information in terms of why we do things the way we do, and why decision trees and hypotheses link so well together, and why the key question is important, and why so many people ignore it, and so on, right? Now finally, let's just present a case summary. And what we've done is we've scored this case against other cases, right? On a scale of 1 to 8, and we've given you explanations of the different rating, you can see that this case scores very highly on communication and case structuring. You cannot solve this case unless you have the very strong ability to to be able to communicate with the interviewer, extract information, understand what they're saying, use that information, and guide the interviewer in your thinking. If you cannot do that, you cannot solve this case. This case calls for strong communication skills and very strong case structuring skills. Arithmetic skills need to be very strong here because there's just so many numbers involved. And business judgment skills tend to be the weakest, yeah. Now, what we've also done is that we wanted to give some guidance in terms of when you should do this case. This is not a case you do at the beginning. This is a case you do with us once you've done about 12 hours of coaching with us. You understand all the fundamentals really, really well. and you now want to apply those fundamentals, right? Do not try this at the beginning. You will get lost doing this case at the beginning. You have to learn many different skills, which we teach in other cases, and then you need to bring them all to bear in this one case. Also, do not expect to solve the case in its entirety or identify all the analysis requirements. No interviewer expects you to solve everything. The point is solve what they ask you to solve and be able to communicate in areas they want you to communicate, right? Secondly, have the skills to use the interviewer for guidance and use the prompts provided. That's the communication part. The interviewer will guide you in terms of what needs to happen here. Finally, this is an MBA level case. Pre-MBA levels, business analysts are not going to expect this case, or associates at BCG and so on, right? The complexity of this case means that if you are weak on communication and structuring, the problem will appear very quickly. So if you're weak at those areas right at the beginning of the case, the interviewer will pick it up because this case forces those issues to come up. The other thing we've done is that based on all the people we screen, not the people that join our program, but the people who screen who want to join our program, we have given a general rating of how MBA candidates would perform on communication, business judgment, arithmetic, and case structuring if they did this case. The average MBA candidate would do poorly on communication and business judgment, pretty well on arithmetic, and okay on structuring. The average pre-MBA candidate, undergrad or master's student, someone without an MBA, would do roughly the same on communication, roughly the same on business judgment. We find that pre-MBA candidates, so at least the ones we pre-screen, tend to be very strong at arithmetic, but very weak on case structuring because they don't have strong enough business skills, which makes sense, right? Those people doing an MBA usually come to us for the screening to join the program after they've done a few months of the MBA, so they'll already start thinking in business terms. But undergraduates haven't started doing it, so the ability to structure isn't that clear for them. And then finally, the areas where candidates typically would fail this case is data overload. They would die with the data. They would struggle to extract the key information that's embedded in text in the data. There's a lot of important relationships that's embedded in the text, and they would not be able to either extract it, and if they did be able, even if they were able to extract that, they wouldn't know what to do with it. Second, the structure wouldn't be obvious. I think most candidates would build a revenue cost tree and they would try to solve them separately. They would, if they even got that far, they probably wouldn't have a key question, so they wouldn't know what they were chasing. And finally, I think my personal feeling from what I've seen is the communication would kill people. The ones who do this case very well are the ones who are very comfortable having a discussion with us. They see the interviewer, a partner level interviewer, as a peer, and they're able to have a discussion. If this case came up in the final round with a partner, the math wouldn't be so heavy, would be my guess. Because as a partner, I would lead this by analyzing the conceptual thinking. That said, I've seen Wharton final rounds and Harvard final rounds where a partner comes up and he gives you a lot of analysis as well. So it really depends on the partner you face, right? I think the most important thing you want to do here is go through the case, understand the underlying logic. If you cannot solve the case, that's not a problem. No one's going to be able to solve this case in its entirety. But you should be able to identify the areas of analysis and with prompting and guidelines, be able to move the case forward. And if you can do that, you'll be very, very successful. And I suppose in closing, I wanted to point out that this is one of the more interesting cases we do. Pharmaceutical cases tend to be very interesting, as do competitive strategy cases. And as always, if our clients have any questions, you're welcome to simply contact us, arrange a phone call, or if you would like, we could do the case with you, or we could do a similar case with you. There are similar cases in the private equity industry that mirror some of these attributes, or even in the electricity industry as well.